In the quiet English countryside of the 19th century, there lived a man with questions so bold they shook the world. Charles Darwin was born into a society with firm beliefs about life's origins, a world where the idea of creatures changing over time was unthinkable. But Darwin wasn't satisfied with easy answers. His mind was drawn to the unknown, to mysteries that few dared to even consider. When he set sail aboard the HMS Beagle, few could have imagined how this journey would change him, and the course of science forever. As he traveled through the rugged landscapes of South America, the Galapagos Islands, and beyond, Darwin observed plants, animals, and fossils that simply didn't fit within the accepted view of creation. There was something strange, almost unsettling, about the patterns he began to notice. Why did certain animals look so similar, yet differ just enough to survive in their own unique environments? Why did fossils from different eras hint at changes no one had explained? Each day on his journey, Darwin recorded these findings in his notebooks, thoughts that burned with the potential to shift humanity's understanding of life. When he returned, he knew that his observations would challenge powerful beliefs. What he wrote would not only shock the public but divide scientists, philosophers, and religious leaders around the world. He faced years of hesitation, wondering if society was ready for his theory. Then, in 1859, his groundbreaking work, On the Origin of Species, was published. In a single book, he laid out the idea that life forms weren't fixed but could change over generations through a process he called natural selection. It was a concept so revolutionary that it would forever alter the way we see ourselves and the natural world. So, who was Charles Darwin? Why did he want to question everything society held as truth? And how did these ideas form in his mind? To understand this, let's start from the beginning of his life, how he grew up, what shaped his early thoughts, and how he became the man who would forever change the way we view the world. Early life and education. Charles Darwin was born on February 12, 1809, in Shrewsbury, Shropshire, in a family home known as the Mount. His father, Robert Darwin, was a well-respected doctor and successful financier, while his mother, Susanna Darwin, from the Wedgwood family, belonged to a line of prominent and thoughtful people. Darwin's grandfathers, Erasmus Darwin and Josiah Wedgwood, were both notable figures in their time. Erasmus was a physician and poet who had intriguing ideas about evolution in his book Zoonomia, speculating on concepts that Darwin himself would later explore in more scientific depth. Meanwhile, Josiah Wedgwood was a famous industrialist and abolitionist, working against slavery, a cause that influenced Darwin's sense of social justice. As a young child, Darwin was already curious and fond of nature. In 1816, a chalk portrait captured him at 7 years old, holding a potted plant, an early sign of his love for the natural world. He grew up in a household that encouraged independent thinking and questioning, though religion played a different role in each side of his family. Both the Darwins and the Wedgwoods leaned towards Unitarian beliefs, though the Wedgwoods were beginning to accept Anglican practices. His father, a freethinker, had him baptized in the Anglican St. Chad's Church. But Darwin and his siblings often attended the Unitarian chapel with their mother. Tragedy struck the family in 1817 when Darwin's mother passed away. He was only 8, but he had already developed a keen interest in collecting objects from nature, plants, stones, shells, and other specimens he found outdoors. The following year, he joined his brother Erasmus at Shrewsbury School, where he boarded and studied under a strict Anglican curriculum. In the summer of 1825, at 16, Darwin took on an unusual role as an apprentice doctor, assisting his father in treating patients across Shropshire. This was a chance for him to gain first-hand experience, but despite this early start, Darwin didn't find himself drawn to medicine. In October, he enrolled at the University of Edinburgh Medical School with Erasmus. However, Darwin found the medical lectures tedious, and witnessing surgeries without anesthesia disturbed him greatly. He struggled to focus on his studies, feeling increasingly disinterested. During this period, Darwin discovered a new skill that fascinated him: taxidermy. He learned this skill from John Edmonstone, a freed black slave who had accompanied naturalist Charles Waterton through the South American rainforests. Edmonstone's tales of the rainforest and his expertise in taxidermy fascinated Darwin and gave him an early sense of the adventures that lay beyond England's borders. As Darwin entered his second year at Edinburgh, he joined the Plinian Society, a student group focused on natural history. The society held debates that often challenged traditional views, including religious explanations for natural phenomena. Darwin took an active role in these debates, and even presented his own findings, such as discovering that certain black spores on oyster shells were eggs of a skate leech. Under the mentorship of Robert Edmund Grant, Darwin assisted in studying the anatomy and life cycle of marine creatures. Grant's support for Lamarck's evolutionary ideas surprised Darwin at first, but it reminded him of the evolutionary ideas his grandfather Erasmus had hinted at. Darwin's interest in geology also grew during his time in Edinburgh. Though he found some parts of the subject less engaging, he learned the basics of plant classification and helped catalog specimens for the university's museum, one of the largest in Europe at the time. However, his lack of interest in medical studies concerned his father, who eventually decided that Darwin should pursue a more stable and respectable career path. In January 1828, Darwin was sent to Christ's College, Cambridge, to study for a Bachelor of Arts degree as a step towards becoming an Anglican parson. At first, he showed more enthusiasm for outdoor activities than academic ones, spending his time horseback riding and hunting. However, Darwin's cousin, William Darwin Fox, who was still studying at Cambridge, introduced him to entomology. Darwin became fascinated with beetle collecting, spending hours scouring the fields for rare specimens. His dedication to this hobby led to several of his finds being published in James Francis Stevens' Illustrations of British Entomology, a respected reference of that time. Through his cousin, Darwin met John Stevens Henslow, a Cambridge botany professor who would become a major influence in his life. Known as the man who walks with Henslow, Darwin gained a reputation at Cambridge for his fascination with natural history, especially among professors who saw scientific study as a way of appreciating divine creation. When it came time for his exams, Darwin applied himself with more focus and was especially captivated by William Paley's book, Evidences of Christianity, which emphasized logic and argument. He successfully completed his exams in January 1831, coming 10th out of 178 candidates. After graduating, Darwin stayed on at Cambridge until June, where he continued to study Paley's natural theology. This book argued that nature's complexity was evidence of a divine creator working through natural laws, a viewpoint that Darwin would later re-evaluate. He also read John Herschel's Preliminary Discourse on the Study of Natural Philosophy, which encouraged scientific understanding through careful observation, and Alexander von Humboldt's Personal Narrative, which described the natural wonders of the tropics. Inspired by these writings, Darwin developed a desire to contribute to science. He even planned a trip to Tenerife with friends to study the natural wonders of the tropics firsthand. Survey voyage on HMS Beagle. After leaving Sedgwick in Wales, Darwin spent a few days with friends at Barmouth before returning home on August 29, where he found a letter from Henslow. The letter proposed him as a promising, though inexperienced, naturalist for a self-funded position on the HMS Beagle, alongside Captain Robert Fitzroy. This position was designed for a gentleman scientist, not simply a collector. The ship was set to depart in 4 weeks for an expedition to survey the South American coastline. Although Darwin's father initially opposed this lengthy voyage, considering it a poor use of time, he was eventually convinced by Darwin's uncle, Josiah Wedgwood II, to approve and even fund the trip. Darwin ensured his role was informal so he could maintain control over his collected specimens, intending them for an established scientific institution. After some delays, the voyage finally began on December 27, 1831, and lasted nearly 5 years. Fitzroy intended for Darwin to spend most of his time on land, studying geology and gathering natural history samples, while the Beagle charted coastal areas. Darwin kept detailed records of his observations and theories, periodically sending his specimens and notes back to Cambridge, including parts of his journal for his family. Although he had some skills in geology and marine biology, Darwin was new to many scientific fields and collected samples to be examined by experts. Despite his frequent seasickness, Darwin maintained thorough zoology notes, focusing on marine life, starting with plankton collected when the waters were calm. Their first land stop was at St. Iago in Cape Verde, where Darwin observed a white layer of seashells embedded in volcanic rock cliffs. Fitzroy had provided him with Charles Lyell's Principles of Geology, which argued for gradual land changes over long periods. Darwin embraced this idea, beginning to think about writing on geology himself. In Brazil, he was struck by the vibrant tropical forests but disturbed by the sight of slavery, which led to heated discussions with Fitzroy. As they moved south to Patagonia, Darwin made a major discovery at Bahia Blanca, fossil bones of massive extinct mammals alongside seashells, hinting at recent extinctions without signs of climate change. One of his finds included a large bony plate resembling the armor of local armadillos. Initially, he thought it belonged to a megatherium, a giant ground sloth. The specimens were shipped to England, capturing the interest of scientists. During his travels with gauchos through the interior, Darwin gained insights into the people, cultures, and politics of the area, particularly as revolution stirred. He also observed that two species of rhea inhabited overlapping territories. Further south, he saw raised beaches, suggesting the land had risen gradually. Reading Lyell's second volume, Darwin accepted the idea of unique origins of species, though his own findings were starting to question some of Lyell's continuous and gradual theories. 3 Fuegians on board, previously taken to England for education, were returning with a missionary. Darwin found them polite and friendly, contrasting sharply with the native tribes they encountered in Tierra del Fuego. He began to see humanity as one interconnected family, evolving from a common origin. A year later, however, the missionary effort failed. Jemmy Button, one of the Fuegians, had settled back into native life with no interest in returning to England. During an earthquake in Chile in 1835, Darwin observed the land rising, and later, high in the Andes. He saw seashells and fossilized trees, solidifying his belief in gradual geological change. He theorized that as land rose, surrounding islands subsided, leading coral reefs to form atolls. In the Galapagos Islands, Darwin noticed that wildlife was linked to older species but adapted in ways unique to each island. Although he didn't collect tortoises himself, he heard that shell shapes differed by island. In Australia, unusual animals like the kangaroo and platypus led him to think it was almost as if separate forces were at work. He observed the Aboriginal people and felt their population had suffered from European arrival. While studying the atolls of the Cocos Islands, Fitzroy's survey work supported Darwin's theories on coral reefs. Fitzroy was writing an official account of the Beagle's journey and, after reading Darwin's journal, decided to include Darwin's observations as a separate volume focused on natural history and geology. In Cape Town, South Africa, Darwin met astronomer John Herschel, who praised Lyell's work for encouraging natural explanations for species replacement, which he called a natural rather than miraculous process. While organizing his notes on the return trip, Darwin speculated that the findings from mockingbirds, tortoises, and other animals suggested a gradual shift in species, which he cautiously noted might challenge the idea of fixed species. Unbeknownst to Darwin, his letters to Henslow had been shared publicly in scientific circles, printed as a pamphlet, and even reported in magazines, including the Athenaeum. Darwin only learned of this in Cape Town, and at Ascension Island, he read a prediction by Sedgwick that he would soon earn a respected place among European naturalists. Inception of Darwin's evolutionary theory. On October 2, 1836, the Beagle anchored at Falmouth, Cornwall. Darwin quickly made his way home to Shrewsbury to visit family and then traveled to Cambridge to see Henslow, who helped him connect with naturalists for cataloging his collections. Darwin's father arranged investments, ensuring Darwin could work independently as a gentleman scientist. Darwin eagerly went around London's institutions, meeting experts who could help identify his collections. Though natural history collections from the British Empire had led to a significant backlog at the time, with some specimens risking being stored away without examination. On October 29, Darwin met Charles Lyell, who introduced him to Richard Owen, a leading anatomist. Owen, working at the Royal College of Surgeons, analyzed the fossil bones Darwin had collected, uncovering surprising results. Among the finds were giant extinct ground sloths, including the Megatherium and the unknown Celidotherium. He also identified a skull from a toxodon, a large, rodent-like creature. Additionally, the armor fragments Darwin had collected were confirmed to be from a glyptodon, an enormous armadillo-like creature. All these extinct creatures were connected to living species in South America. In mid-December, Darwin rented a place in Cambridge to organize and classify his collections and begin writing about his findings. By the end of the month, he resolved a publication issue with Fitzroy, who decided to publish Darwin's diary as a separate volume, later known as Journal and Remarks. Darwin's first paper explained how South America's landmass was slowly rising. With Lyell's support, Darwin presented it at the Geological Society of London on January 4, 1837. The same day he shared his bird and mammal specimens with the Zoological Society. The ornithologist John Gould soon revealed that the Galapagos birds Darwin had thought were varied species, blackbirds, grosbeaks, and finches, were actually 12 distinct species of finches. In February, Darwin was elected to the Geological Society's Council, where Lyell's address highlighted Owen's findings on Darwin's fossils, supporting the idea that species maintained continuity across regions. In mid-July, Darwin began his B notebook, jotting down ideas about species transformation. He drew his first evolutionary tree, a branching diagram symbolizing the connections among species. In March, Darwin moved to London to work closely with scientists like Charles Babbage and stayed with his brother Erasmus, a friend of writer Harriet Martineau. Martineau supported ideas about species changes and welcomed Darwin's views, though these concepts stirred debates among Anglicans defending traditional beliefs. Around March, Gould shared that the Galapagos mockingbirds were distinct species, and that what Darwin thought was a wren was actually a finch. Although Darwin hadn't labeled finches by their islands, he used notes from others on the ship, including Fitzroy, to determine which species belonged to which islands. He observed how the two types of rheas were distinct species with shifting habitats in different areas. By mid-1837, Darwin was already speculating that one species might transform into another, drawing connections between living species like the rheas and extinct animals like the macrauchenia, which resembled a giant llama. He outlined his thoughts on how traits varied across generations and sketched a branching tree, symbolizing evolution and challenging ideas of a hierarchy among species. Overwork, illness, and marriage. As Darwin delved into his study of species change, he found himself juggling more responsibilities. He continued to rewrite his journal and took charge of editing and publishing the expert reports on his collections. With support from Henslow, he secured a Treasury grant of £1,000, a sum worth about £115,000 in today's terms, to fund a multi-volume work titled Zoology of the Voyage of HMS Beagle. Darwin maximized this grant, even setting aside funds for his planned geology books, and committed to tight deadlines with his publisher. But all this work took a toll on his health. On September 20th, he experienced an unsettling heart palpitation, prompting his doctors to advise him to take a break. Darwin spent some time in the countryside, visiting family at Mayor Hall, Staffordshire, though they were so eager to hear about his travels that it didn't offer him much rest. His cousin, Emma Wedgwood, who was caring for an ailing relative, was especially supportive. Darwin's uncle Josiah shared an observation about cinders disappearing beneath the soil, sparking Darwin's interest in earthworms' role in soil formation, a concept he later presented at the Geological Society in November 1837. By February 1838, Darwin's journal was printed and ready for release, alongside the first volume of the narrative, although Fitzroy was still completing his section. Around this time, William Whewell encouraged Darwin to become secretary of the Geological Society. Though initially hesitant, Darwin took on the role in March 1838. Despite his workload on the Beagle reports, Darwin advanced his study on species change, actively gathering insights from naturalists and even people involved in selective breeding, like farmers and pigeon breeders. This intense schedule started to affect his health more seriously. By June, Darwin frequently suffered from stomach pain, headaches, and other symptoms, especially during periods of stress, like meetings or social gatherings. The exact cause of his illness remained a mystery, and attempts at treatment provided only temporary relief. In late June, Darwin decided to take a break and went to Scotland to study geology. He visited Glen Roy and initially thought he was observing marine raised beaches, only to later accept these were shorelines of a lake that formed during the Ice Age. By July 1838, Darwin felt refreshed and returned to Shrewsbury. Used to making notes about animal breeding, he jotted down thoughts on marriage on 2 pieces of paper labeled Marry and Not Marry. The pros included having a constant companion and friend in old age, though he noted it could mean less money for books and loss of time. Deciding in favor of marriage, he spoke to his father, then visited his cousin Emma, sharing his ideas about species change with her. On January 29, 1839, Darwin married Emma, and together they raised 10 children, 7 of whom lived to adulthood. Malthus and Natural Selection. While continuing his studies in London, Darwin began reading more broadly, including the 6th edition of Malthus's An Essay on the Principle of Population. On September 28, 1838, he noted Malthus's claim that human populations, if unchecked, double every 25 years in a rapid geometric progression. This growth quickly outpaces food supply, leading to what Malthus described as a population crisis. Darwin connected this idea with Augustine de Candoll's Warring of the Species among plants and animals, where numbers stay balanced due to limited resources. He realized that since all species reproduce beyond what resources can support, those with traits that help them survive would likely pass them on, while others would fade out. He described this process as a force pushing each species to adapt to changing conditions, forming new and specialized traits in the process. In October 1838, about 15 months into his systematic research, Darwin later recalled in his autobiography, he read Malthus's work for enjoyment. His observations of animal and plant behavior made him immediately grasp that beneficial traits would persist while less helpful traits would disappear. He saw that this could lead to the creation of new species, giving him a theory to pursue. By mid-December, Darwin found a parallel between farmers choosing the best livestock for breeding and nature favoring organisms with chance variations, ensuring that each new trait was suited to its environment. He called this natural selection, as opposed to the artificial selection of breeding. On November 11, Darwin visited Mayer and proposed to Emma, sharing his ideas with her once more. She accepted and, in her letters, showed her appreciation for his openness about their differing beliefs. She was deeply Unitarian and worried that his honest doubts might divide them in the afterlife. As he searched for a home in London, his illness continued, and Emma urged him to take care, writing, "So don't be ill anymore, my dear Charlie, till I can be with you to nurse you." They found a house on Gower Street, which they nicknamed Macaw Cottage due to its bright interiors, and Darwin moved his museum there over Christmas. On January 24, 1839, Darwin was elected as a Fellow of the Royal Society, FRS. Darwin and Emma were married on January 29 at Mayer in a ceremony adjusted to suit Unitarian practices. Right after, they took the train to London to start their life together in their new home. Geology books, barnacles, evolutionary research. Darwin had developed the framework for his theory of natural selection, which became his primary focus. He conducted extensive experiments in selective breeding of plants and animals, gathering evidence that species were not fixed and refining his ideas to support his theory. For 15 years, this research was secondary to his main work, which involved writing about geology and publishing reports on the Beagle's collections, especially his studies on barnacles. His interest in barnacles began in 1835 when he collected a barnacle colony from Chile, which he named Mr. Arthrobalanus. Confused about how this species related to others, he became fixated on their classification. He wrote his first analysis of the species in 1846 but did not formally describe it until 1854. In May 1839, Fitzroy's delayed narrative was published, and Darwin's Journal and Remarks received positive reviews as its third volume, later published independently on August 15. In early 1842, Darwin shared his thoughts with Charles Lyell, who noted that Darwin didn't see a clear start to each new group of species. Darwin's book The Structure and Distribution of Coral Reefs, focusing on his theory of atoll formation, was published in May 1842 after 3 years of research. Following that, he wrote a preliminary outline of his theory of natural selection. To escape the stresses of city life, Darwin and his family moved to rural Down House in Kent in September. On January 11, 1844, he shared his theories with botanist Joseph Dalton Hooker, humorously comparing his thoughts to confessing a crime. Hooker responded positively, expressing interest in how Darwin believed such changes occurred, as he found existing theories unsatisfactory. Darwin's sandwalk at Down House became his favorite path for thinking. By July, he had expanded his outline into a 230-page essay that he planned to develop further if he were to die unexpectedly. In November, the sensational book Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation stirred public interest in evolution. While Darwin criticized its poor scientific basis, he carefully reviewed his arguments in light of its popularity. He completed his third geological book in 1846 and rekindled his passion for marine invertebrates from his student days, focusing on the barnacles he had collected during his voyage. In 1847, Hooker read Darwin's essay and provided helpful feedback, though he did not fully support Darwin's ideas and questioned his views on the continuity of creation. To improve his ongoing health issues, Darwin visited Dr. James Gully's spa in Malvern in 1849, finding some benefit from hydrotherapy. Unfortunately, in 1851, his beloved daughter Annie fell ill, reigniting his fears about hereditary illness. She passed away later that year after enduring a long series of health crises. After 8 years of studying barnacles, Darwin found evidence of homologies, where slightly altered body parts adapted to serve different functions in new environments. In some cases, he observed tiny males living as parasites on hermaphrodites, indicating an evolutionary stage toward distinct sexes. This research earned him the Royal Society's Royal Medal in 1853 and established his reputation as a biologist. Upon finishing his barnacle studies, he famously declared his dislike for them. In 1854, he became a Fellow of the Linnean Society of London, which allowed him access to its library. He began rethinking his theory of species and, by November, recognized that the differences in descendants could be explained by their adaptation to various conditions in nature. Publication of the theory of natural selection. By early 1856, Darwin was exploring the idea of whether eggs and seeds could survive being transported across the ocean, helping species spread across vast distances. His friend Hooker began to question the traditional belief that species were unchanging, while their colleague Thomas Henry Huxley firmly opposed the idea of species changing over time. Lyell found Darwin's ideas intriguing but didn't realize how extensive they were. After reading a paper by Alfred Russel Wallace about how new species are introduced, Lyell noticed similarities to Darwin's ideas and encouraged him to publish to establish priority. Although Darwin felt no urgency, on May 14, 1856, he began drafting a short paper. However, he often got stuck on complex questions, which led him to expand his work into a larger book titled Natural Selection, which would also include a section on humans. He gathered data and specimens from naturalists worldwide, including Wallace, who was in Borneo. In mid-1857, Darwin included a section titled Theory Applied to Races of Man, though he did not write about that topic. On September 5, 1857, he sent a detailed outline of his ideas to American botanist Asa Gray, excluding human origins and sexual selection. In December, Wallace asked if Darwin's book would cover human origins, to which Darwin replied he would avoid that subject due to its sensitive nature, even while encouraging Wallace's ideas. Darwin's book was still unfinished when, on June 18, 1858, he received Wallace's paper on natural selection. Realizing he was forestalled, Darwin forwarded it to Lyell as Wallace had requested. At the same time, his family faced tragedy with children in the village succumbing to scarlet fever. He entrusted his friends with the publication of their findings. After discussion, Lyell and Hooker decided to present both Darwin's and Wallace's work at the Linnean Society on July 1, titled On the Tendency of Species to Form Varieties, and on the Perpetuation of Varieties and Species by Natural Means of Selection. Tragically, on the evening of June 28, Darwin's infant son died from scarlet fever, and he was too heartbroken to attend the presentation. The announcement of the theory received little immediate attention. The president of the Linnean Society noted in May 1859 that the year had not brought any groundbreaking discoveries. Only one review bothered Darwin. Professor Samuel Houghton from Dublin criticized the novelty of their findings, stating that what was new was false and what was true was old. For the next 13 months, Darwin struggled to summarize his work while dealing with his health issues, but received encouragement from fellow scientists. Lyell arranged for it to be published by John Murray. On the Origin of Species turned out to be surprisingly popular, with the entire first printing of 1,250 copies sold out when it was released to booksellers on November 22, 1859. In this book, Darwin presented a lengthy argument filled with observations, inferences, and anticipated objections. He provided evidence supporting common descent, including similarities between humans and other mammals. Although he discussed sexual selection, he subtly suggested that it might explain differences among human races. While he avoided a direct conversation about human origins, he hinted at the importance of his findings with the phrase, "Light will be thrown on the origin of man and his history." In the introduction, he simply stated his theory. As many more individuals of each species are born than can possibly survive, and as, consequently, there is a frequently recurring struggle for existence, it follows that any being, if it vary however slightly in any manner profitable to itself, under the complex and sometimes varying conditions of life, will have a better chance of surviving, and thus be naturally selected. From the strong principle of inheritance, any selected variety will tend to propagate its new and modified form. At the conclusion of the book, he expressed, "There is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers, having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one. And that, whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms most beautiful and most wonderful have been, and are being, evolved." The term evolved appeared only once in the first 5 editions of the book. During that time, evolutionism was often linked to other ideas, particularly embryological development. Darwin first used the term evolution in The Descent of Man in 1871 and added it to the 6th edition of On the Origin of Species in 1872. Responses to publication. The book sparked global interest and stirred up less controversy than the earlier work Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation. Although Darwin's health kept him away from public debates, he eagerly followed the scientific reactions, reviewing press articles, critiques, and even humorous caricatures while communicating with colleagues around the world. While the book didn't focus on human origins, it did contain hints about humans' animal ancestry, which could lead readers to draw conclusions. One of the first reviews provocatively asked, "If a monkey has become a man, what may not a man become?" It suggested that this topic should be left for theologians, as it could be too risky for regular readers. Among the early positive responses, Huxley's reviews criticized Richard Owen, a prominent figure in the scientific community whom Huxley sought to challenge. In April, Owen published a review that criticized Darwin's supporters and dismissed his theories, infuriating Darwin. Meanwhile, Owen and others began advocating for the idea of evolution guided by a supernatural force. Patrick Matthew, who had hinted at natural selection in his 1831 book, brought attention to his earlier work, although he hadn't fully developed the concept. The Church of England had mixed reactions. Darwin's former tutors, Sedgwick and Henslow, rejected his ideas, while more liberal clergymen viewed natural selection as a tool of divine design. The cleric Charles Kingsley even saw it as a noble idea of God. In 1860, a book called Essays and Reviews, written by 7 liberal Anglican theologians, shifted clerical focus away from Darwin's work. Its ideas faced harsh criticism from church authorities, who labeled them as heresy. In this book, Baden-Powell claimed that miracles contradicted God's laws, suggesting that belief in them could lead to atheism, while praising Darwin's insights. Asa Gray discussed the idea of teleology with Darwin and shared his pamphlet on theistic evolution, which argued that natural selection could align with natural theology. The most famous debate occurred at the 1860 Oxford Evolution discussion held by the British Association for the Advancement of Science. Bishop Samuel Wilberforce, who was not opposed to species change, argued against Darwin's views and the idea of humans descending from apes. Joseph Hooker defended Darwin, and Huxley famously remarked that he would rather be descended from an ape than from a man who misuses his intellect, which symbolized a victory for science over religion. Even among Darwin's close friends, Gray, Hooker, Huxley, and Lyell, there were doubts. But they strongly supported him, as did many younger naturalists. Gray and Lyell sought harmony between faith and science, while Huxley highlighted the division between them, vigorously opposing clergy dominance in education. He aimed to replace the influence of clergymen and aristocrats with a new generation of professional scientists. Huxley challenged Owen's claim that human brain structure proved humans were distinct from apes, proving Owen wrong in a long-standing debate humorously dubbed the Great Hippocampus Question. In response to critiques about the unexplained origin of life, Darwin pointed out that people accepted Newton's law of gravity, even though the cause of gravity remained a mystery. Despite these challenges, he suggested in a letter to Hooker in 1871 that life might have originated in a warm little pond. Darwinism evolved into a broad movement encompassing various evolutionary ideas. In 1863, Lyell's Geological Evidences of the Antiquity of Man popularized the concept of prehistory, though his cautious stance on evolution disappointed Darwin. Shortly after, Huxley's evidence as to man's place in nature reinforced the idea that humans are anatomically related to apes, while Henry Walter Bates's The Naturalist on the River Amazons provided evidence for natural selection. Advocacy efforts led to Darwin receiving the Royal Society's Copley Medal, the highest scientific honor in Britain, awarded on November 3, 1864. On that same day, Huxley held the inaugural meeting of the X Club, which promoted science free from religious constraints. By the decade's end, most scientists acknowledged that evolution occurred, although only a minority accepted Darwin's view that natural selection was the primary mechanism. The Origin of Species was translated into many languages, becoming a foundational scientific text that attracted attention from people across various backgrounds, including the working class, who attended Huxley's lectures. Darwin's ideas resonated with contemporary movements and became an integral part of popular culture. Cartoonists began depicting humans with animal traits, humorously connecting Darwin's theory to visual art, which helped make it more approachable. During a period of illness in 1862, Darwin grew a beard, and by the time he re-emerged in public in 1866, caricatures of him as an ape linked all forms of evolutionism closely to Darwinism. Descent of man, sexual selection, and botany. Despite suffering from recurring health issues during the last 22 years of his life, Darwin continued to work tirelessly. After publishing On the Origin of Species, which summarized his theory, he focused on conducting experiments and writing his larger book. This work examined how humans descended from earlier animals, the evolution of society, mental abilities, and the reasons behind beauty in nature. He also expanded into innovative studies of plants. In 1861, Darwin's inquiries about insect pollination led him to study wild orchids. He discovered how their flowers adapted to attract specific moths, ensuring cross-fertilization. In 1862, he published Fertilization of Orchids, which provided a detailed demonstration of natural selection and its ability to explain complex ecological relationships through testable predictions. During his declining health, he often rested in his sickbed, surrounded by various experiments related to climbing plants. Among his visitors was Ernst Haeckel, a passionate supporter of Darwin's ideas, who combined them with Lamarckism and Goethe's philosophies. Wallace also remained supportive, although he increasingly explored spiritualism. Darwin's book The Variation of Animals and Plants Under Domestication, released in 1868, was part of his planned larger work. It included his unproven theory of pangenesis, which aimed to explain heredity. The book was initially successful and translated into multiple languages. He completed much of a second part focused on natural selection, but it was never published during his lifetime. Lyell had already raised awareness about human prehistory, and Huxley had demonstrated that humans are anatomically similar to apes. In 1871, Darwin published The Descent of Man, and Selection in Relation to Love, presenting evidence from various sources that illustrated the continuity of physical and mental traits between humans and other animals. He introduced the idea of meat selection to explain certain impractical features in animals, like the peacock's elaborate feathers, while also discussing human cultural evolution, differences between the sexes, and racial classifications, emphasizing the unity of humankind. His research culminated in The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals, 1872, which was one of the first books to use printed photographs. This work discussed the evolution of human psychology and its connection to animal behavior. Both books were well received, and Darwin noted that people were engaging with his ideas without feeling shocked. He concluded that despite all of humanity's noble qualities, we still carry the marks of our humble beginnings. Darwin's extensive research led to publications on insectivorous plants, the effects of cross and self-fertilization in the vegetable kingdom, the variations in flowers of the same species, and the power of movement in plants. He continued to gather information and communicate with scientists worldwide, including Mary Treat, whom he encouraged in her scientific pursuits. Darwin was the first to recognize the importance of carnivorous plants. His botanical studies were interpreted and popularized by writers like Grant Allen and H.G. Wells, significantly advancing the field of plant science in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Death and funeral. In 1882, Darwin was diagnosed with what was then called angina pectoris, which referred to coronary thrombosis and heart disease. When he passed away, doctors noted anginal attacks and heart failure. Scholars have since speculated about his long-standing health issues. Darwin died at Down House on April 19, 1882. His last words were to his family, expressing to Emma, "I am not the least afraid of death. Remember what a good wife you have been to me. Tell all my children to remember how good they have been to me." While Emma rested, he comforted Henrietta and Francis, saying, "It's almost worthwhile to be sick to be nursed by you." He had hoped to be buried in St. Mary's Churchyard in Down. However, at the request of his colleagues and after public petitions, William Spottiswoode, president of the Royal Society, arranged for Darwin to be honored with burial in Westminster Abbey, near John Herschel and Isaac Newton. His funeral took place on April 26 and was attended by thousands, including family, friends, scientists, philosophers, and dignitaries. Legacy and commemoration. As Alfred Russel Wallace remarked, Darwin created a greater revolution in human thought within a quarter of a century than any man of our time, or perhaps any time. He provided a new understanding of life and offered a theory that served as a powerful tool for research. Combining the findings of various